Discussion number one. Is this defense going through a regression with Mr. Wilks at the helm? I mean, one thing, you know what? I don't pat myself on the back too often, Sunil, but, if somebody's not going to toot your horn for you, somebody's not going to toot your own horn or your horn for you, beep, beep, if you know what I mean. One thing that we talked about ad nauseum this offseason is about how the 49ers were going to be more of an offensive team than a defensive team. And all this week, everybody else wants to start talking about, well, maybe the 49ers are more of an offensive team. Never thought that would happen. Guess who thought that would happen? We thought that would happen. We talked about it all offseason. But with that means now people are saying, well, is the defense regressing? And if so, is Wilks at fault? What do you think here?
So, it's the way that people criticize Brock Purdy, I think, is the way that maybe you can criticize the 49ers defense, because stats-wise, what they're putting up, the numbers are what they are. They're still holding teams to 12, 13 points per game. Obviously, they're stopping the run. The passing game has always been kind of where their Achilles heel is. And, teams are able to move the ball sometimes through the air on the team. But the eye test, this defense doesn't look as dominant as it has in previous years, right? It's kind of like a last-second interception, is what ended up changing the trajectory of the game. Or, usually, I think in previous years, the defense has had multiple kind of wow moments where you're scared to go up against this defense. I don't know if I'm seeing as many of those moments, but it could just be a feelings over facts things, because the numbers just still are still very, very good. They're still a very highly ranked defense. My question, I know you've been pretty high on Steve Wilks. My thing with Steve Wilks is he's never really managed a defense that was, upper echelon elite in any of his defensive stints. He's obviously a well-respected coach in the league, but as far as just his defenses, I don't think he's ever had a top 10 defense. I could be wrong with that, but with him as a defensive coordinator, I don't think he's had a top 10 defense. Now, the question was, when he has the amount of talent that he inherited of the 49ers, is his principles, because he's always been well-respected, going to translate to just a lights-out defense? And I guess for me, where I'm talking about the regression, it seems like everybody thought that when he comes in, he's going to secure that last link, right? We had the defensive line that's always been dominant, the linebacking core that's always been dominant. It was always the secondary that was that Achilles heel. I don't know if that's been tightened up to the extent that we expected under Wilks. Maybe that was unfair expectations, though. That's why I wanted to see how you felt about that.
I think, what's interesting about this team? Well, two things. One, I think when the offense starts to look, quote unquote, better than the defense, people are like, well, I'm used to this. What's going on here? The defense must suck. And, looking at the numbers, I mean, they're only giving up 14.5 points a game. They've forced some turnovers, maybe not as crazy as they were at times last year. But when you look at this 49ers defense historically, let's look at last year. I remember specifically, they didn't force a lot of turnovers in the first half of the season. Once Brock Purdy took over, they started forcing double the amount of turnovers that they had in the first half of the season. And, we talked about that as being a big reason maybe why they were getting over 30 points a game and what have you. If you go to the year prior, I specifically remember through the first 7 or 8 weeks during that year, they were giving up 130 yards rushing a game. It was a lot of rushing yards per game. They couldn't stop the run at all. Then they played the Rams. The Rams are like the slump buster for the 49ers. They play the Rams. They hold them to 52 yards rushing. And from that point on, they gave up one 100-yard rushing game from the whole second half of the season through the playoffs, everything. So this defense, oddly enough, does tend to start a little bit slower. Now, 2019, I think, was a different story. They were just hot from the get-go. But 2021 and 2022, there was things that you could point to with this defense where you're like, I don't know if it's the same. Are they as good? I don't think what's happening now is really much different than what was happening before, other than maybe the teams to start haven't been as good. And so actually the numbers, oddly enough, look better. They're not giving up a ton of rushing yards. They're not getting gashed. There's like one drive you can point to in all the games where you're like, yeah, but the one drive. And outside of that, that's it. Like, we're giving teams credit for one good drive a game. That's how good the defense has been. So I don't think that I am worried about the 49ers defense. I don't think it's necessarily taking a step back. Now, I would like to see the second half of the season. And if they can amp it up, I think that would be par for the course. But I think a lot of it really does have to do with how good this offense looks right now. It's finally taken the shine away from the defense, who, by the way, is only giving up 14.5 points a game.
Right. And I mean, like I said, this is all more feelings over facts. I think just the eye test, right, which is what people, want to criticize Brock Purdy on. We're going to get into that later. But the eye test, to me, this defense doesn't look as good as it has in previous years. That's what my question is. Do you think the eye test, Jesse, that like just visceral feeling when you watch this defense, do you still look at it as that dominant defense that's top 3 in the league kind of defense? I don't know. They're not spoken about, I think, as highly as some of these other teams in the league, which is different from, what we've seen in previous years.
You know what it is they're not getting after the quarterback as relentlessly as they have in the past. I think that is the difference. That when I watch it and I'm looking at it, I'm like, even when they've had their struggles, they usually can get after the quarterback a bit, or at least that's the feeling I've always gotten is we know the front four, they're not going to have to blitz. They're going to be able to get after the quarterback whenever they want. There are long stretches throughout this season where they're getting almost no pressure. I think that is the difference. So if you're just going off of the eye test, that's what I'm seeing where I'm like, okay, they've got to pick that up. They've got to figure that out. But I think, like I said, it's no different than past seasons where, 2021, it was like, they can't even stop the run. They're getting gashed for 130 plus a game. Like the eye test told us they couldn't stop the run. And then the stats back that up. And then last year it was like, yeah, the defense is really good, but they don't force any turnovers. Where are these turnovers at? Like the year before, it seemed like they went long stretches, weren't forcing turnovers. Here we go again. They got Charvarius Ward. They moved on from Tart and all these other things. Are they going to be able to start forcing turnovers? And they couldn't. And then they started to. So that's why I'm saying I agree with you. There is something about the eye test. It's definitely the pressure for me and getting after the quarterback relentlessly. But overall, when I just look back to other seasons, there was other eye test things and statistics that back that up that said, okay, they do start a little quote unquote slow defensively.